At PRG, we deliver supply chain strategies that enable business growth as well as improve supply chain resilience. I'm happy to share that today we are very fortunate to have Deep SenGupta join us, the founder and CEO of DSG Global, to share his knowledge and expertise around the tariff space and provide strategies that can help you reduce your tariff risk. A little bit about Deep's background. He started DSG Global in 2014, was at FedEx from 2002 to 2014, where he was the principal of FedEx Regulatory Consulting Group, providing international trade and regulatory consulting to numerous entities. Deep was also responsible for providing international trade services to governments on a global basis. To FedEx, Deep was at KPMG, Asia Pacific Tax Practice, where he helped establish the international trade and customs practice in India and advised several Fortune 500 clients on market access issues for their South Asian operations. He has also assisted the US government, involved in both imports and exports, and we're very pleased to have such a renowned subject matter expert join us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deep to do his deeper dive presentation on kind of the current state of tariffs and how you can mitigate issues around tariffs for your own business.
Michael, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I like that pun, a deeper dive. I joke that clients usually call me when they're in deep trouble. So we're going to talk today about the trade war, specifically tariff minimization strategies. As on the date of this recording, we've been about 100 days into the trade war, and my slides change almost on a weekly basis based on all the new tariffs and the suspensions back and forth. It's been a roller coaster ride. And the companies that are affected the most are usually the small to medium sized companies who don't have the deep pockets, and again, to deal with tariffs. So here are some high level strategies that might help such companies. We've got 8 strategies we'll talk about today on how can importers minimize the tariff impact. I'm not going to read the slide, but just very quickly, number 1 is conducting a tariff impact analysis. Number 2, and this is only for those who are driving or not looking at the screen, customs valuation. Number 3, tariff classification. And we're going to go into each of these in a little more detail in the future slides, in the next slides. International commercial terms, known as Incoterms. Number 5, country of origin rules. Number 6, free trade agreements with various countries, such as with the North American partners called USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA, duty drawback, and finally, warehousing, such as a bonded warehouse or a foreign trade zone. Let's jump right into more detail. Tariff impact analysis is a great strategy for first seeing how much duties and taxes you're currently paying, as that will help us figure out ways and means to reduce that spend. I tell my friends, if there's any household reeling over high costs and they want to reduce their credit card spend, the first thing is to look at your credit card statement, and you can see these recurring expenses and subscriptions. You can see, areas you should not be spending on, wants versus luxuries. Similarly, in the customs world, it's your ACE data, which provides you this credit card level of detail. Stands for the Automated Commercial Environment, and it's the government platform. And when you join ACE and you get an ACE report, you'd be surprised at the level of detail it provides on every single import entry going back a couple of years, you can see every import transaction, the date it came in, the amount of duty you paid, the harmonized codes that your product came under, the manufacturer, the vendor that you imported the goods from, the country you imported the goods from, and it divides by customs duty, MPF, any anti-dumping. And what this really allows you to do is to check for any tariff classification errors. It allows you to check for various countries that you're importing from. You can say, "Oh wow, I didn't know I imported this much from China." Maybe to mitigate these high tariffs, we can import from somewhere else. So looking at this data is really the first step to figuring out tariff minimization strategies. We can see maybe that you're importing a lot of goods from your foreign manufacturers by way of repair costs. And you can say, hey, we can actually legitimately reduce the value on that. So that is the first step, a tariff impact analysis. Customs valuation is point number two. Now, why is customs valuation important? Well, the amount of customs duties you pay on any transaction depends upon the tariff rate, which is a percentage, but also on the customs value you declare, because your duty is a percentage based on that value. So, legitimately reducing that value, if it's inflated, is a good strategy. Now, over 95% of import transactions is pretty plain vanilla. It's based on your sales price from the seller to the buyer. And that's known as transaction value in customs parlance. But if you didn't have a sale and there's maybe a repair, maybe it's a consignment, it's a stock transfer, it's just a material transfer between related parties where the relationship has influenced the price. A regular transaction value doesn't apply. There's five other methods that you're supposed to use sequentially. So, really evaluating, possibly reducing your valuation or looking at a better valuation method is key. Also, remember, customs duty is essentially on goods, not services. So, looking at your contract, if there's any non dutiable expenses, some services that are not related or a condition for the import can really be taken out as well. So, it really depends upon your transaction and these different costs. So, we can maybe strip it out legitimately. Also, if you do business with related parties, corporate taxes transfer pricing sometimes may have a huge profit margin. And that's more than maybe what is considered normal in your industry. So that's an opportunity right there to maybe, modulate the amount of profit margin so you reduce your customs value. There's another strategy in case of multi-tier transactions that a lot of companies are using. It's called first sale for export. And what this means is, suppose you, as a US importer, are buying from a middleman, and the middleman, the agent, buys from a factory. Now, ideally, you're paying customs duty on the middleman's sales price, but under certain circumstances, and if certain conditions are met, you can actually pay customs duty on the factory price, the manufacturer's sales price. Now, this isn't for everyone. We've got to ensure that the entire sales are legitimate, that the manufacturer knew the goods were destined for export to the US, and so on and so forth. But it could be an option for several companies, this first sale for export idea. The next strategy is tariff classification. Now, why does tariff classification help? Well, the first trade war the US government, back in 2018, had different lists of products. Different harmonized codes were under different lists, and they would attract 25% on Chinese made goods, or 15%, or 7.5%, based on the HS code, which is called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule code. It's a 10-digit code. So, actually classifying your products correctly can ensure you're paying the correct duties, not too high, not too low, but correct. And also, as all these executive orders come out from the White House, many times there are exemptions for certain codes. So it's always a good idea ensuring your products are classified correctly. I see that 90% of products are classified only at the time you get the FedEx truck coming around and the shipping clerk says, "Hey, I've got to prepare this export documentation. What's the harmonized code?" So that's not the way to do it. Ideally, when the new product is being developed, sitting with the engineers and figuring out the correct code, and then maybe looking at options of tariff engineering or looking at binding rulings published by customs can maybe help us research any more duty advantageous codes. So that's really something I recommend to clients, that put some work into it, because at the end of the day, as the goods go out of the door, if the shipping clerk just chooses other, which is, the lazy way of doing it, that's usually a higher tariff rate. So keep that in mind. International commercial terms, known as Incoterms. Now, if you have seen the Incoterms chart, you'll see it ranges all the way from X works, which means maximum responsibility on the buyer, all the way to the right, which is DDP, or deliver duty paid, which is maximum responsibility on the seller, including customs clearance and paying for customs duties. In this day and age of high tariffs, I tell US importers that DDP, where your seller takes care of all the duties, is probably not the most cost effective, because you have no control over the strategies for minimizing and optimizing your customs duties. So I recommend maybe a DAP, delivered at place option, where your seller brings the goods all the way to the US port, but you, as the buyer, are responsible for customs clearance, organizing the customs broker, and paying for duties and taxes. The next strategy is country of origin. Ever since the last trade war, and continuing till today, um, just a few weeks ago, rate on Chinese origin goods was 145%. Thankfully, after the talks in Geneva 2 weeks ago, it's come down to 30% for this interim period. But that's made a lot of companies that relied on Chinese manufacturing to really rethink their sourcing. And what they're doing is they're choosing another country like Mexico or Malaysia or Vietnam for the final manufacturing. And they hope that this strategy will ensure that goods are no longer considered Chinese origin and won't be subject to those high duty rates. But the country of origin for your goods really depends upon the last country where there was a substantial transformation. Many times, if it's just a simple assembly in Mexico or Malaysia, Vietnam, that does not amount to substantial transformation. And US Customs is going to say, no, 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 it's still country of origin China. So, what constitutes substantial transformation? In a sentence, it's when finished a country in which a new item emerges with a new name, a new shape, a new use. So spend some time researching whether this operations in the final country actually confers a different country of origin for your product. Otherwise, you'll be surprised and hit by those high duty rates on the original country where the raw materials came from, in this case, China. It's complicated, but there's a lot of rulings, and we recommend you get a little more expert advice. Free trade agreements. Free trade agreements, as one famous economist, Jagdish Bhagwati from Columbia, said, the spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements. So the World Trade Organization expects countries to offer most favored nation rates to all countries, except those you have trade embargoes with. But some countries have been making side deals, like bilateral or multilateral trade agreements. Now, the United States has trade agreements with over 20 countries. You'll find them on the US Trade Representative website. But during this trade war, they were still subject to these additional tariffs. Normally, under a free trade agreement, you get a duty free treatment if your goods are eligible from that country. One concession has been made recently on goods from Canada and Mexico, saying, okay, they won't be subject to that 25% tariff if the goods are USMCA compliant, which stands for US Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement. So, always, and my prediction is that as the trade war progresses, more and more countries are going to lay out the red carpet and offer US goods a free trade status or duty free status, but always check the rules of origin for that free trade agreement. Do your products really qualify? Just because your goods come from, let's say, Australia, doesn't automatically mean it qualifies for the US Australia Free Trade Agreement. There are certain regional value content or certain tariff shift rules that you need to be eligible under. Duty drawback. Duty drawback is a great program if you don't mind the cumbersome, data intensive process. Duty drawback allows you a refund of 99% of the duties that you paid on your imported goods if they are later exported in the same shape or they're used for products that are exported or if the goods are scrapped and destroyed in the United States. This obviously gives you cash back from the government. It's like getting your refund, which is great. And, it helps companies with cash flow and their bottom line. The government doesn't give free money to everyone. So you have to provide proof in your claim that the goods were paid. You paid customs duty on the goods, that you paid customs duty on the same goods that were later exported or were used in manufacturing products that were exported. I kid you not, companies that are duty drawback facilitators are really having a huge business right now because of the number of companies applying for duty drawback. But it's probably not worth the effort if it's just a minuscule amount. So you've got to make that balance of, how much duty drawback is worth the effort. I'm going to talk about bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones. Imagine if you could defer your customs duty. Wouldn't that be great? So instead of paying right now, you pay when your goods are stored in a warehouse and then leaves the warehouse. So a bonded warehouse, quite frankly, is US program that came out in the 1800s. to allow for more government control and security for stored goods. And the great thing about a bonded warehouse is that it is in the United States. You're allowed to store your goods for 5 years. And if you think the duty rates are going to fall, it's a great option because you pay duty only when your goods leave the bonded warehouse. There's a little bit of lack of flexibility compared to a foreign trade zone on what you can do in a bonded warehouse, but based on your operations, if it's simple operations, it's just a great option to consider. A foreign trade zone, unlike the 1800s when a bonded warehouse under customs supervision was brought into force, foreign trade zones came into effect in the 90s to really improve US industry's competitiveness. A foreign trade zone is considered not to be part of the US territory. It's considered a notional foreign country, and you pay the duty only when the goods leave your zone and enter the US territory. But the duty rate is fixed if it's at the time the goods enter the zone, if it's under privileged foreign status. Again, there's a potential for obviously duty deferral, in some cases duty exemptions, and there's many state and local tax exemptions for foreign trade zones as well. Further, if you are a high volume importer, you can save on a weekly entry and reduce your merchandise processing fee per weekly customs entry. So that's another strategy. But between bonded warehouse and FTZ, you've got to consider your business operations. Friends, that's it from me. And Michael, I'm delighted to take any questions you might have.
Thank you again, Deep, for a great presentation and very informative, and clearly a lot for people to digest. We're going to go through some questions that hopefully will help companies better understand, what you've talked about, and kind of make it a little bit more practical, for people that have currently experiencing supply chain challenges. Uh, First, it's around supply chain strategy. So you talked about a lot of different, specific ideas around supply chain and what companies can do. At Product Realization Group, we often work with companies that are in the middle of product development. So can you talk a little more about strategy as it relates to developing products and trying to mitigate the risk of tariff as you're going through that development process?
Yes, Michael. So I also help many smaller companies, as you said, startup size in the different, in the early stages of product development. And I tell a lot of companies that this trade war is probably not going to go away with respect to US China operations. I think that, if you see countries, we just heard that India is negotiating with the US and is going to offer zero duty for US goods. I don't know how far that's true, but if you look at countries that have a free trade agreement with the United States, that's a great place to consider for locating your sourcing because usually countries with free trade agreements with the US are friends of the US politically, economically. There's a lot of trust, and we don't see that overturning overnight. Now, with China, on the other hand, there are IPR issues, there's a lot of tension, and even though there's cheaper labor cost and resource availability, one cannot with any guarantee say that duty rates are going to fall to 10%, which is the new low. So I would I would actually caution companies to put all their eggs in one basket, especially if that basket is looking like a very high tariff source of your goods.
No, that's a great response. Thank you for that. And when I think about this kind of strategy, You mentioned earlier in your presentation about, this idea of substantial transformation. And, the way I visualize that is you've got different points coming from different places, maybe some from China and some from India and, whatever other countries, that have a lot of components. And then perhaps, you do transformation in Mexico or whatever country that are kind of immune from tariffs and have less tariffs. And then that can be kind of a viable strategy. But could you talk a little bit more about that concept of substantial transformation as it relates to, strategy of supply chain?
Absolutely. So, what a lot of companies did a few years ago during the first trade war is they started moving their assembly operations to Mexico from China. So they'd say, okay, we'll still get all our products from China, but we'll do the final assembly in Mexico. So, US Customs, in several penalty cases and rulings, said by just taking all the products from China and just doing a simple assembly in Mexico does not make the product country of origin Mexico. It is still subject to this China tariffs under Section 301 as if it were a Chinese origin product. So, what would change? What would change is if the nature of operations in Mexico is complex. And to show it's complex, you got to show the number of processes that bring about a complete change in the finished product. You have disparate, tubes, transistors, PCBs, but it creates a new product altogether. That is substantial transformation. Usually, I ask my clients to submit a ruling to customs blessing that, yes, Mexico is the country of origin. We also try to show other justifications, such as the amount of cost that's incurred in Mexico, the amount of employees, the facilities, and try to show that there's been a tariff shift as well, in addition to the regional value content that was imparted in Mexico. So, as
Yeah,
an
oh,
example.
that's very helpful. Thank you, Deep. And it doesn't sound like it's simple. There's a lot of nuance to what is substantial transformation, what's not substantial transformation. But following the thread of supply chain strategy and how you navigate through with all this tariff risk, in your mind, what would be the point where you would say there's enough tariff in, let's say, China, for example, to warrant actually moving your manufacturing out of China or out of, another region that is going to be impacted by tariffs?
So that depends upon various factors, Michael. For instance, one could be the lack of availability of a raw material. Many of my clients have told me, in spite of the trade war, they still are going to remain in China because the labor cost differential still makes sense. But if the China tariffs is going to kill your business, then definitely move out, I think. But, so it's, cost needs to outweigh the duty and taxes for you to make that move. And that depends upon different businesses, depending upon how simple your business is or how much premium and value add you can charge the customer. So it depends on a couple of different questions there.
Yeah, and what we have been recommending to our client base is there does seem to be a substantial realignment between U.S. and especially U.S. and China, and with a bias towards reshoring, right? Where there's a strong interest in bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. So we recommend clients strategically, tariff aside, to really seriously consider expanding manufacturing outside of China. There was a strategy called China Plus One. Now there's a strategy called China Plus Two, and then I think the next step after that would be kind of not manufacturing in China. So, but as you mentioned, there's some assemblies, there's components that are still likely going to be coming from China. So it's getting somebody that has an understanding of the full cost impacts risks is really important, where you can make a decision that you think is a good one and then find out that you really haven't avoided much and your risk is high and your costs are high. So with that, it's more about this tariff impact assessment. I mean, I think that's kind of a good thread to pull on. And so how do you better understand the risk and tell us how you
Absolutely. And just on your previous point, we recently assisted a company and they actually looked at three different countries and the various tariff scenarios and finally whatever made sense for them. So a tariff risk assessment really is, I believe, step one on looking at your tariff spend and looking at where your goods come from, which countries, which manufacturers, see if you can, optimize sourcing from vendors in lower tariff origin countries, and looking at various strategies for maybe duty drawback for goods that come into the United States but are destined to other overseas markets, maybe using a foreign trade zone or a bonded warehouse. So that study is really key to see, what your tariff impact is going to be.
Very good.
And it all starts with your ACE data, which is the data customs has on all your import transactions. And if you don't have your ACE data, you can obtain a CD and a spreadsheet from customs under a Freedom of Information Act request.
So something step one is really understanding where you currently stand in the tariff landscape, assuming that it is stable for any period of time, right? So that that's a whole nother challenge is how do you navigate when these things seem to change on a day-to-day basis. But part of that goes back to what we talked about, supply chain strategy, and how do you develop resiliency within a supply chain about that aspect, and what are your recommendations around getting companies to be more resilient as they look to develop their supply chain?
Yeah.
More specifically, some of the points you talked about, tariffs and, you talked about tariff classification. How common a problem is tariff classification? Challenges. What are the challenges around, this idea of classifying tariffs?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I was dealing with, one of the most innovative companies in the world, and a few years ago, and I sat with all their engineers, and they said, help us classify this thing. And I said, okay, based on your technology, here are the possible codes. Which one do you think is most applicable for your item? And the head engineer said, I'll take the one with the lowest duty rate. Well, ideally, that's not the way we recommend companies classify. There are so many companies that underpay customs duties, and I say it will catch up with you. It will catch up with you not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe 3 or 4, up to 5 years down the road, and customs may ask you for their money back with interest. So I always say that get the accurate classification for your commodity. Having said that, don't overpay customs duties. And the way customers and companies overpay customs duties is not by doing their research. They just go by, the tariff heading is 10 digits. They look at the first 2 digits, the next, the chapter, the heading, the section, and then they go other. So not bringing in the technical personnel, probably you just end up with other, which is the highest duty rate. So spending some time looking at potential rulings that customs has given pretty much identical products to yours imported in the past can maybe uncover some opportunities for duty savings. But it's all got to be legitimate and not just choosing a random duty rate. I also recommend that when customers assign a harmonized tariff classification, they base it on some principles. The principles in the customs parlance is called the general rules of interpretation. There's six different rules. And also there's different binding rulings in the customs online customs ruling database called Cross that I recommend people research.
So just pushing a little deeper into that thread, you mentioned you talked to a company and they wanted the lowest tariff, and that there's some risks. What are the risks? So let's say that I'm a company and I just get it wrong. What are the risks to companies if they, get these things wrong and then they get caught?
Well, I was dealing with a very, it's like new age aeronautical company. Can't take names, obviously. And in the first couple of years of their operation, they were figuring it out, figuring out imports, and then they start ramping prototype manufacturing, and then all of a sudden they're importing quite a lot. And that's when customs, it comes under their radar, saying, okay, this is now a little more larger company. And customs said, hey, these items you've been misclassifying going back 5 years. And this was a six-figure bill that customs gave this company. So we had to come in, do an analysis. And at that point, we did a prior disclosure. Prior disclosure means you're telling customs, we confess we made an error. And if you do this before customs launches an investigation, you can just pay the duties and you avoid penalties. So that's what we did. And I tell all the companies that are in a startup phase that maybe not now, but a few years down the road, when you hit customs radar, they're going to evaluate your customs code. So get it right from day one.
Really finding somebody that knows the ins and the outs of this can be quite helpful. But I would appreciate any other advice, thoughts, maybe, websites people could go to, or resources that could be leveraged.
Well, customs always recommends you do your due diligence, which in customs speak is called reasonable care. And under reasonable care, they ask, have you had a technical person, review your product vis-a-vis the harmonized schedule? And have you consulted an expert? It could either be a consultant, an attorney, or a customs broker who's familiar with the classification tariff book of 3,000 pages and can really determine which is the appropriate code for you. So that's really what I recommend. Just expecting the shipping clerk who may not have had any experience, exposure to come up with the right code is really asking for trouble in the long run.
Very good. Thank you for that. And we're, running out of time. What other final insights or thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up the session here?
Well, as I mentioned down the list, checking your valuation is really the biggest thing. Now, the amount of tariffs that you pay is really a multiplication of the duty rate, which is determined in oftentimes by your harmonized code, multiplied by the value. So trying to look at the value and seeing if there's any planning opportunities is a recommendation, and also getting your classification tariff code correct. In addition, based on where you supply from, choosing a free trade agreement like USMCA and ensuring your products qualify is a great idea. And if you have any exports of goods after your goods come into the US, consider a free trade zone or a bonded warehouse to potentially defer such duties. And like I said, my drawback friends are not getting enough sleep. They're so busy. And that's for a reason, because you actually get a refund from the government if you can show that goods that you paid duty on were subsequently exported or used in the manufacture of goods export.
Very good. Well, this has really been enjoyable, Deep. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate your insights around tariffs and how companies can mitigate tariffs. And